My name is Ray Haberski, and I've been one of the few authors that have been sponsored by the Academy to write volumes on Franciscan history, and mine is on Franciscan media. So I come to this as a historian of U.S. intellectual history. So a lot of the stuff I was looking at in Franciscan media was the exchange of ideas. So often that exchange was between the readership and the editors or the writers of magazines. But it also, of course, with media, flowed into TV, radio, the internet, things like that. So what I have here is a very brief presentation of a sample of what's in the book. The book is almost done. But every time I talk to people, they give me something else to look at, so which is good. He'll say, don't look at it, and I'll just move on. But I wanted to come up with just one sort of overview point that I have been trying to work through with this project. There is no this perfect explanation for what the Franciscan approach to media was, nor was there one way that different orders used media or the way that they projected a certain Franciscan message. But if there is one thing that seems to keep coming up, it is that throughout these different types of media, Franciscans seem to deal with the messiness of being Catholic in America. And I'll go into different examples of how I think that's the case. Now, for me as an intellectual historian, that is interesting, because intellectual historians often look at the exchange of ideas and how ideas take shape and organize disparate thought, right? So it could be the culture wars, right? The messiness of the culture wars, and yet we put it into a box, and we can describe what happened between 1979 and 1989 as the culture wars, right? Which doesn't really describe often what people felt at the time, and doesn't really give you a sense that it had a history before that or after that. What I've been trying to grapple with in this project is that there is no sort of flashpoint. There's no touchstone necessarily. Vatican II is not a really great sort of anchor, in a sense, for what something changes in Franciscan media. Things are happening well before that. And the response to Vatican II was so disparate in many ways that there's no way to say that Franciscans did this in response to Vatican II. So that's just sort of a disclaimer that this is not the history of Franciscan media. It's certainly not going to be the last, and it's not the most comprehensive. But I think it does bring up some interesting aspects of Franciscan media. Okay, so one of the magazines that was sort of pivotal to my work, because it is so comprehensive and has such a long history, was St. Anthony Messenger. For the first 30 years or so of the Messenger, this was a typical cover, right? The woodcutting of St. Anthony. And the idea was that this was going to be representative of the type of magazine that it was. It was primarily a smallish devotional sort of fundraising magazine sent out to people to support the missionaries in the Southwest or around the Midwest. Okay? And it really took place from the 1890s into the 1920s and 1930s, and this was its image. Through the 30s and 40s, St. Anthony's Messenger changed. It evolved into very much a family magazine. It grew in size, it grew in departments, it grew in the number of writers, and it is extraordinary to see how it begins to bring together different types of conversations about Catholic life in the United States. You can see the transition from the immigrant Catholic culture, right, that many Catholic historians have written about, to what Catholics are becoming as Americans, and all the different types of Catholic Americans there are. And I think this is one of the places where those ideas and those identities are worked out. So one of the most interesting figures in this early part of St. Anthony Messenger and of Franciscan media is Fulgence Meyer, right, who was a missionary priest based at St. John the Baptist province. He wrote something. He was the person who held sway in this one section of the magazine called the Tertiary Den. And I opened up the book with this letter to Fulgence Meyer from a woman named Dixie M. Now, it is an extraordinary letter, but it's also reflective of a lot of letters that they got. This woman is going through a terrible marriage. Her husband is abusive. She lives with most of his family. She has 2 kids. She's wondering what to do with her life. And Meyer is given this story. It's tragic. And he says in another column, this woman doesn't need to stay with her husband. If her husband continues to abuse her in this way, he doesn't deserve her. Now, this is a letter back to a Catholic woman in 1930, right? So Meyer is suggesting, I think, that he had to balance his role, right, as a Catholic priest, as an American living in a country that afforded certain rights and liberties to everybody, including women, right, because they could vote by this point, right? They had a political identity as well, but also as a Franciscan, as somebody who had some responsibility over the personality and the shape, the identity of the magazine he was writing for. But the thing that made it so fascinating is that this is one of many letters, most of them from women, coming to magazines like St. Anthony Messenger, talking about how do we live as Catholics in the messiness of life, in the tragedy of life? What do we do? And if this only happened one or two times, it'd be interesting, but it happens decade after decade. And you see this right up through, of course, to today. The St. Anthony Messenger, when it began to run a series on the clergy sexual abuse cases, the letters to the editor were fascinating, yet again. And the way that that the Franciscans responded to those letters were really revelatory. Also within the magazine, and as well as other magazines, were lots of essays written by women for women. So one of the things that became pretty clear is that many of the family magazines were written for women. They were the readers, mostly the readers of these magazines. And so typically they would fall into two types of literature. One type were they sort of fictional stories with a particular moral, and most of them had to do with marriage, or being a better mother in some way, how to relate to your kids. Others were like this, like the one that Serena Ward used to. She wrote a column called Whispering from Padua, and Serena Ward held this column for at least 2 or 3 decades, and she would collect letters to her and then talk about them in this column. And again, it's a really interesting window into what women were thinking about, what kind of questions they were grappling with at the time. And she would talk about women in general. She would use like one name for all women, and then try to relate practical advice for how to deal with troubled children. It was really fascinating. Everything from troubled marriages to children with handicaps, with disabilities, would be found in her columns. So again, it's before you have the sort of advice shows and the self-help culture of the 60s and 70s, and certainly the 80s and 90s, this was an attempt at creating that sort of approach or that relationship. Another section of the book, I deal with what I call little magazines, and this is not obviously something that I've come up with, right? So there's a history of little magazines in U.S. Cultural history. Typically, little magazines were very particular editor-driven magazines. They were often used in New York City and Chicago for arts and literature, and it's where the newest sort of trends in modernism might show up or something like that. But I think Franciscans also had a genre of little magazines that were very primarily editor-driven. So it'd be 1 or 2 editors for a magazine that would shape the magazine. It would not have very high circulation, but would have a particular type of political personality, And it could be something like Immaculata, right, which was a straight-up devotional magazine, and it lasted for, really, it's still published online, but it became really important in the 1980s because it pushed for the canonization of Lily Kateri. Yeah. So it became a very important moment for the magazine. It became sort of reshaped their identity. Or Franciscan Message, which becomes much more of a family magazine in the 1950s and 60s. But you can see it's, one of the covers of the magazine was an interesting reflection on the sort of historical moment, people scared of the nuclear campaign, the nuclear contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. Other little magazines, Padre and The View, both very much sort of editor-driven, I thought this is one of the greatest cover arts that I found in magazines, based on the decision by the Supreme Court to disallow school prayer. And it got a lot of coverage in many Catholic magazines. Same thing with the rise of Kennedy to run for president, that also generated a great deal of editorial support for the idea that it could be a Catholic president. One of the key drivers of Franciscan media was the Franciscan Herald and Forum and the Franciscan Herald Press up in Chicago. One of the things that seemed to be really important to a lot of Franciscan media was that they were very savvy about how to distribute or versify, be very versatile in their media. So many publications produce a magazine or a journal, and also a book series or a pamphlet series. And the Franciscan Herald and Herald Press was very important in that. It published often people that would never have been published in any other trade press or professional house. It would come out of the Franciscan and other Catholic presses. Okay, so if magazines were sort of the backbone for the first half of the 20th century for Franciscan media, the second half was taken up with what to do with electronic media. All right? I think, as you probably know, the FCC for a long time, Federal Communications Commission, mandated that you had to have a certain amount of time devoted to sort of public service programs, and many religious, usually what they did is they did Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant shows, and they would each get equal time. And for a while, many Catholic shows they took advantage of that and would be on a variety of different stations because the FCC allowed or forced stations to provide this time. And so it developed, what you had developing were these personalities, radio personalities. Father Justin Figues, who comes out of central Pennsylvania. He has a radio show for many years. First, it appealed to the largely Polish population in Pennsylvania, but it becomes a nationally syndicated show by the 1940s. The Ave Maria Hour, radio hour, which was produced in just outside of New York City and used a lot of talent from the New York stage. Both are nationally syndicated shows and can claim thousands and thousands of listeners over the course of their history. But the one that probably becomes the most famous and becomes the most popular is the Hour of St. Francis, which was produced in Los Angeles, all right, and sponsored by the Santa Barbara province. And what is interesting about this, it has a history of about a little bit less than 20 years. And somebody said before, you're saying the hour, right? It never was an hour. The radio show was 15 minutes. It would become a TV, there'd be TV segments of a half hour, and that's about as long as it got. But listening to the shows, and you can actually get maybe a dozen or so still on the web, and the Santa Barbara, the Provincial Archives has the record. That's why I worked to get a lot of this stuff, all the financial documents and a lot of the scripts and things like that. It's a really interesting cross-section of the talent in LA and Hollywood that are Catholic or willing to sort of lend their time to the Hour to do shows. And most, at first, they just lent their voices, and then later on they would actually be in these little movies and these little TV programs. But the radio programs are fascinating. This one was about a soldier coming back from Korea. And so it was produced in this particular show was produced in 1954, this particular program. And it's read by Jack Webb, right, of Dragnet? Yeah. So I just wanted to play just a little bit of it for you. I think almost immediately you can get a sense for what the program's point is. This is the music that would introduce every episode. Sort of Sheehan-esque in that way, right? Yeah.
The Hour of St. Francis, whose chief concern is to speed the return of peace in the heart, in the home, and in the world, hopes that the program you are about to hear will be a long stride in the direction of that peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Webb.
Jack Webb.
We have a letter that we'd like you to hear. This letter is addressed to Private Thomas T. Williams, but it was written for our country, for our world, and for you. Dear Tom, I'm writing you this letter because I read about you in the paper yesterday. Your story filled half a column over on page 2 under a headline that read, "Quadruple amputee back from war zone."
Not exactly the most peppy thing to listen to on a Sunday, but...
Well, I read how you'd been wounded, how you crawled across the ice of a frozen reservoir, how you'd lost both arms and both legs from frostbite and gangrene. I read that you were 22 years old, but it was the last sentence in the story that made me write you this letter. I can see you, Tom, being lifted out of a hospital plane.
Okay. We could go on. 15 minutes. Right, but the idea, right? So this is a sob story, right? It's a very sad story. Now, you can go in one or two directions. And I really did think I knew where it was going. It's about sacrifice for the country. This is what it takes sometimes. It wasn't. The story ends. The last 5 minutes is about how the entire country is to blame for this. We are all responsible for this man's condition. Why is it that we went to war? How does war tear up our brothers and sons, sisters and daughters? Who should take on, the burden, the guilt for this? It's incredible, right? This is 1954, 55. This is when Eisenhower is saying, in one of his campaigns for the American Legion, the entire country has become a foxhole. He actually said this in one of the campaigns. And in the foxhole, nobody is an atheist, right? So we all have to stick together, to pull together into sort of national religion. Not that we have to go to war necessarily, but we're all going to have to sacrifice. And that was not the message that was being portrayed here. In many ways, what I found in a lot of Franciscan media was not a direct challenge to sort of the national narrative, but certainly an alternative. And even an alternative maybe to the most prominent Catholics at the time, because there's no way that Sheehan would have been saying something like that at that same time, And by this time, by the late 50s, the Hour of St. Francis was being listened to on hundreds of radio stations around the country and in other parts of the world. So it wasn't something relatively minor, okay? It did suggest that there was an alternative narrative that was being developed by the Franciscans in Catholic society. A few years later, in the early 1960s, the Hour gets what it's always wanted. And Karl Holzschneider, I don't know if any of you know Karl, he was one of the motivating forces behind the Franciscan Communications Center, which was built in the early 1960s to produce TV shows, which is where everybody was going at this point, right? And so this was the blessing of that center. It never takes off. I mean, it's a wonderful place to produce films, but it's so expensive that for the most part, it never really goes anywhere. And by the late 1960s, they've stopped producing what they hoped to do, which were these half-hour-long films. And this is the crew, basically, that filmed most of these shows, these half-hour shows. Very small. There's Emery Tang there, right? But I wanted to point out somebody who's often unheralded. That's Juanita Vaughn. Juanita Vaughn wrote over 400 scripts for the radio show. All right, she also did a lot of the stuff, a lot of the scripts and script directing for the TV show. So she is an absolutely phenomenal person. She started out as a secretary of the Hour of St. Francis, and in one of their crises, they didn't have any writers, she started writing. And she's the one who wrote that Welcome Home Soldier, which I am now realizing she probably would read the newspaper and things like that and come up with catchy stories that she would then translate into half-hour radio shows. So, a really interesting person, but of course they didn't keep them any records about her. So I don't, yeah.
St. Francis Center in LA,
yeah.
She was very involved with the center there.
Yeah, but I haven't found anything about her writing for the Hour of St. Francis, like the actual scripts that she, like the first drafts. I can't find any of those. That's okay. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I know she did a lot. So bringing this further up to the present, after Vatican II, there was really an incredible sea change in Franciscan media. A lot of what had existed before the 1970s disappears in the first half of the 1970s, not because of Vatican II, but because of the price of producing magazines. And a lot of the provinces give up on trying to fund them. St. Anthony's Messenger does not. They continue to produce, they do other types of media. They create the Catholic Update, the little sheet on homilies. They start to branch into a tape series, which is where Richard Rohr really takes off as a personality in Catholic society. But these are the guys that I've been reading an awful lot in St. Anthony's Messenger, and they really shaped the views that people received about Vatican II in St. Anthony's Messenger. I wanted to show just a couple of examples of this. Catholic Update was really done, Jeremy Harrington was saying, in part to produce income for Franciscan media, which became the sort of parent company that took over Franciscan Communications and St. Anthony Messenger and its press. But Catholic Update was an enormous success. Millions and millions of these sheets were produced and distributed all throughout the United States. And he says as far as South America. But one of the things that they also did was they created really elaborate websites for AmericanCatholic.org, which was the sort of successor to Franciscan media. And one of the best, I would say, has been their response to the sexual abuse case crisis. It's still one of the best places to go for a one-stop list of articles to read, many of them written by and published in St. Anthony Messenger Press. But two of the most influential recent Franciscans, one of them is her.
My statement. I don't care whether you like it or not. It's time somebody said something about all these tiny little cracks that you have been putting for the past 30
you get the idea. You know who she is.
years.
Yeah. Let's try to move this along here. Mother Angelica is a Franciscan nun. She founded in Alabama this incredible, she built a media empire. It is second to none in the world. And when it comes to religious media, it's valued over $1 billion at this point. It is a remarkable story that really has not been told fully yet. To tell you the truth, I don't know how to fit her into some sort of Franciscan narrative necessarily. Yeah, okay. but at the same point, if you watch her show and you watch Mother Angelica Live, which is really the thing that made her into a major force in media, she too deals with people in the messiness of their lives. She takes any question posed to her, and she tries to speak directly to the crisis that the person is in. It's a remarkable thing, and I don't think it's all that different than what I saw in the letters to Fulgence Meyer, right? And in the same way, right, somebody that has paid no attention to Mother Angelica, but lots of attention to this guy.
How do we continually how do we get to that true self? That's the goal. I want to be
Richard
in that
Rohr.
space.
I think you are, but none of us are 24 hours a day. It's largely a matter of letting go of the false self.
Okay. So Richard Rohr, as many of you know, he comes out of St. John the Baptist province. He becomes important in media through tapes and through small pamphlets that he begins to write. But it's really through his work reaching out to men's spirituality that sets him apart from many other people at the time. He is, in some ways, the counterpoint to what much of Franciscan media had done for a long time, which was appeal to women. And I think Rohr understood that there had been, especially after Vatican II, a huge deficit in reaching out to men who the church was losing in pretty high numbers. And so that makes him a force, but then he branches out into other ways to appeal to a different type of American spirituality. He and Mother Angelica, if they do align in some way, is that they both see modernity causing problems for faith, and that people have lost the ability to defend the idea of faith in modern America, and they are giving them ways to do so. Very different ways, but with constituent groups that are both massive, and they're both incredibly savvy, using the media where people are, what people like, to bring them into the fold. And so while I see that their messages or their appeals being quite different, their methods are quite similar. And it's it was funny, Mother Angelica, the one thing she would constantly sort of decry is that Oprah never paid attention to her. That she would have loved to have been on Oprah once. And here Richard Rohr is actually, I guess, one of her favorites. So has had quite a bit of exposure through that. So that's my cross-section of Franciscan media. And we can take questions after Eric's presentation.